Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 575, Proving a Negative. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I am well-ish. Yesterday afternoon, I got my booster vaccine, and following the guidelines, no, not the guidelines, the suggestions. They're more like guidelines. No, following the suggestion of my virologist, who I love so much, I switched it up. And I went from my 2 doses of Pfizer in April to a dose of Moderna yesterday afternoon. And I can feel the Moderna way more differenter than I could feel the Pfizer. So I am well-ish. I am definitely glad I haven't gotten sick from this nasty bugger so far. Because today is not the pleasantest day. I did not go walking this morning, but not just because of this. I didn't go walking this morning because it's pouring outside. And while I am devoted to my walks across the Delaware these days, there are limits. However, one of the things for which there are no limits is my love for Tracy. Because Tracy has, in the middle of all sorts of craziness and moving and all of that, she thought, you know what, we should do the Craftlit Bookmark Exchange again. And she's volunteered to do the heavy lift of the paperwork on the back end again, because she's just like that. So, Craftlit Bookmark Exchange, link in the show notes. Not only that, but it's the same link as last year. So if you still have that lying around, you can access it that way. It is a Google form. It will ask you for your name, your address, what kinds of books you like to read, and whether you would be willing to ship internationally. And last year, it was really, really fun. I love the bookmarks that I've got, and I still use them, which is even more cooler. I'm just going to make up words all day today. I think it's my right when I feel like this. But Bookmark Exchange, if you are interested in making or buying a bookmark to send to a lovely Craftlit listener, please, please, please step on up and join the fun. But now, something serious. The name of this podcast episode, Proving the Negative, comes from a moment early on in today's chapters. We're doing chapter 26, Mr. Grace Explains Himself, and chapter 27, Amy Belden. That said, there is a moment early on in today's chapters where there is a brief discussion about the problems with proving a negative. And what with the world being just a little nutty lately, I kind of wanted to take a bit of a dive into this topic because I often find myself very frustrated listening to news or local arguments or school board meetings and thinking, my God, we would not be in any of these situations right now if people had just learned logical fallacies when they were in school. And you know, because I've talked about this before, that I was very fortunate in 8th grade, and Mr. Mahalik at Orange Grove Middle School in Tucson, Arizona, spent an entire marking period, teaching us logical fallacies. And I was not the best student at logical fallacies in my class. Tyler was spectacular at this. I wish I could remember his last name. That would be so funny. But Ty and his friend Scott, wow, that is coming out of nowhere. Ty and his friend Scott were like fiends when it came to being able to recognize logical fallacies. And I remember, it must have been about 10 years ago, I saw that Ty had written something on Facebook that was a fallacious argument. And a part of me died at that moment. It was actually really kind of sad. That being said, I think it's worth exploring a little bit because we are following a character who is a lawyer, and law and justice and things like that often look confusing on the outside because there's the spirit of the law, there's the letter of the law. And when you are trying to prove a case or discover against whom you could be proving a case, it gets very complicated sometimes. And people can get quite upset digging into their position of their belief. For the last several years, there's been a lot of talk of, I don't believe so and so did such and such. And I find that there's precious little follow up along the lines of, well, I don't care what you believe. What are the facts? By not pushing back and asking for the facts, a lot of truly outrageous statements have been allowed to stand. And once things, as we know, are printed, they become fact, which I'm saying with a very unhappy look on my face, because of course that isn't the way it should be. But this whole theory of, well, you say it enough and it gets printed enough, then it becomes true, we've seen a lot of. And almost all of those instances that, at least that I can think of, all go back to somebody saying, well, I don't believe in climate change. That's fine. You can believe what you want, but we are forcing the climate to change, and not in a good way. So what can we do about that? Believing a fact or not believing a fact doesn't change the fact. There's a group, I may have mentioned them before. I totally accidentally stumbled upon them. It's a group called Ocean Cleanup that's run by a really adorable and still incredibly young looking Dutchman. Ocean Cleanup, I just caught a video recently, has successfully started their program of cleaning up the giant garbage patch in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And it's fascinating because if you go back and watch on their YouTube channel, you can see them going way back, actually. The first plans that they came up with were genius and really, really cool and totally didn't work. And instead of throwing up their hands and saying, well, shoot, that was a great idea. Too bad we lost all that money. They were having great success in cleaning up rivers in a way that was automated and required little in the way of human interaction, so it was effective and inexpensive. The garbage patch is a lot more complicated. And so their first, Mach 1 didn't work. Mach 2, very different from what they had originally wanted to do and planned to do, but version 2 is working. And I bring them up because it is one of those things that happens where people say, well, I don't believe it's that big a problem. Ah, so you're an expert on this topic. I see. You must have devoted lots of time and effort into researching this. No, I just don't believe it's a problem. Then there's the corollary to that. Oh yeah, that's a really bad problem, but there's nothing we can do about that. Well, thank goodness that there is this Dutch kid who has decided, oh no, there is something we can do. And he's a good fundraiser and he's an excellent speaker in several languages and an innovator. And now this dream that's been going, I think they've been working on it for about 10 years, is real and it's working. And that's awesome. That kind of belief, the belief that there is a way to improve something, to change something, to make something better, that kind of an anti-nihilistic stance is lovely. And often situations like that are looked upon like, oh, it's so great that he had so much faith in his ideas, or it's so great that they had so much faith in the ability of people to come together and raise money and be proactive and make something work that looked like it couldn't work before. And that's also lovely. But once you start bringing in belief and faith to factual things, people start making errors in logic. There was a On Being episode with Krista Tippett from, oh my gosh, it must be 15 years ago. It was when we were in Tucson, so it was probably closer to 10 or 11 years ago. Wow. Krista Tippett interviewed a scientist. I think I want to say she was a physicist, and she'd been working in the scientific world from, I believe, the mid to early 60s on up through the early aughts, whenever this episode aired. And I remember her talking specifically, the scientist, talking specifically about faith and how she, a scientist, is a person of faith. She's a spiritual person. She was a churchgoer. She never saw a conflict between her physics work and her faith, because to her, they required two different kinds of thinking. In her scientific world, that was logic and proof-based. It was also hypothesis and proof-based, meaning that you have a hypothesis, you set out to prove it. The way, the means that you use to prove the thing, you determine in advance, and then your methods, and then you test those methods and you come up with a negative that did not prove your hypothesis. Well, now that's interesting, because does that mean that your hypothesis was wrong or that your methods were wrong? So you go back to the drawing board. Is there any other way that I could possibly prove this? Ooh, yes. What if we changed this variable? So now you've altered your methods and you go after proving that again. And if that doesn't work, you change your method again. So there's this, I think of it like a mouse in a maze, that you come across a dead end and go, back up. Okay, let's try that again. Go a different way. Oh, that didn't work. Back up. Try it again. And as scientists work, those moments of what we muggles would look at as failure are in fact successes. Ah, well, that wasn't the solution. So now we need to go about it this way. And to me, it's a huge tragedy that this isn't how science is taught in high school, because I think we would be in a much different place right now if it would be hard to teach science like this in high school, but hard is not impossible. What appears to be impossible for a lot of us to do these days is to separate faith from science, like the scientist on the Krista Tippett episode, the On Being episode. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's a point at which, when Arthur Dent looks up the entry on the Babelfish, he comes up with this. The book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, talks about Ulan Khulufid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters: Where God Went Wrong, some more of God's greatest mistakes, and Who is this God person anyway? He later used the Babelfish argument as the basis for his fourth book, entitled, Well, That About Wraps It Up for God. The argument went something like this. I refuse to prove that I exist, says God, for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing. Ah, man says. But the Babelfish is a dead giveaway, isn't it? It proves you exist, so therefore you don't. QED. Oh, says God, I hadn't thought of that, and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. I heard that when I was in 8th grade, right around the same time that I was taking my logical fallacy class. And from that point on, in my mind, the division between faith and proof were separate. Proof denies faith. Yeah, religion without faith is nothing. Yes, they're two different systems, and applying the methods of either system to the other is going to get you into a horrible muddle. We have allowed the systems of faith to encroach upon systems of logic, and turning around and snarkily trying to apply systems of logic to the arena of faith is also an enormous mistake. It doesn't do as much damage to the planet, but it's still a mistake. You've probably heard Carl Sagan. It's Carl Sagan or Martin Rees. I'm not sure which one said it, but the statement that got a lot of traction was an absence of evidence, so not having any evidence for something, is not evidence of absence. Carl Sagan did actually say that we have an impatience with ambiguity, and these things are, I think, arguably true. However, it gets into really tricky situations when somebody, like at a school board meeting, she said, quoting a recent school board meeting, someone gets up arguing that they have all the proof, all the data. They can't provide you with any of it, but they have all the data proving that masks harm human people, that wearing a mask during the day is making you breathe toxic air. You know, ignoring the fact that medical professionals do this all day, every day, forever. Fine. So they have all the proof. And somebody in the audience called out, where's your proof? Give us a study. And the speaker turned around and said, Where's your proof that masks don't harm people? Well, you can't prove a negative. And the burden of proof lies with the person who is making the claim. So where this touches the Leavenworth case is in today's chapter, the first of the 2 chapters we listened to. If we don't know that something is true, and we have no evidence that it's true, that is not enough to feel that we have proved our case. Just because you don't have evidence proving that Eleanor didn't do it does not mean Eleanor didn't do it. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, evidence of not having done something. It just resonated with me today, so I thought I'd share. All right, let's listen to chapters 26 and 27 of The Leavenworth Case by Anna Catherine Green, read for us by Kevin Green. Here we go.
Chapter 26. Mr. Gryce explains himself. Sits the wind in that corner? Much ado about nothing. I do not propose to enter into a description of the mingled feelings aroused in me by this announcement. As a drowning man is said to live over in one terrible instant the events of a lifetime, so each word uttered in my hearing by Mary, from her first introduction to me in her own room on the morning of the inquest, to our final conversation on the night of Mr. Clavering's call, swept in one wild phantasmagoria through my brain, leaving me aghast at the signification which her whole conduct seemed to acquire from the lurid light which now fell upon it. I perceive that I have pulled down an avalanche of doubts about your ears, exclaimed my companion from the height of his calm superiority. You never thought of this possibility, then, yourself? Do not ask me what I have thought. I only know I will never believe your suspicions true. That, however much Mary may have been benefited by her uncle's death, she never had a hand in it. Actual hand, I mean. And what makes you so sure of this? And what makes you so sure of the contrary? It is for you to prove, not for me to prove her innocence. Ah, said Mr. Gryce, in his slow, sarcastic way, you recollect that principle of law, do you? If I remember rightly, you have not always been so punctilious in regarding it, or wishing to have it regarded, when the question was whether Mr. Clavering was the assassin or not. But he is a man. It does not seem so dreadful to accuse a man of a crime. But a woman, and such a woman! I cannot listen to this. It is horrible. Nothing short of absolute confession on her part will ever make me believe Mary Leavenworth or any other woman committed this deed. It was too cruel, too deliberate, too— Read the criminal records, broke in Mr. Gryce. But I was obstinate. I do not care for the criminal records. All the criminal records in the world would never make me believe Eleanor perpetrated this crime, nor will I be less generous towards her cousin. Mary Leavenworth is a faulty woman, but not a guilty one. You are more lenient in your judgment of her than her cousin was, it appears. I do not understand you, I muttered, feeling a new and yet more fearful light breaking upon me. What? Have you forgotten, in the hurry of these late events, the sentence of accusation which we overheard uttered between these ladies on the morning of the inquest? No, but you believed it to have been spoken by Mary to Eleanor? Of course, didn't you? Oh, the smile which crossed Mr. Gryce's face. Scarcely. I left that baby play for you. I thought one was enough to follow on that tack. The light that was breaking upon me. And do you mean to say it was Eleanor who was speaking at that time? That I have been labouring all these weeks under a terrible mistake, and that you could have righted me with a word and did not? Well, as to that, I had a purpose in letting you follow your own lead for a while. In the first place, I was not sure myself which spoke, though I had but little doubt about the matter. The voices are, as you must have noticed, very much alike, while the attitudes in which we found them upon entering were such as to be explainable equally by the supposition that Mary was in the act of launching a denunciation or in that of repelling one, so that, while I did not hesitate myself as to the true explanation of the scene before me, I was pleased to find you accept a contrary one, as in this way both theories had a chance of being tested, as was right in a case of so much mystery. You accordingly took up the affair with one idea for your starting point, and I with another. You saw every fact as it developed through the medium of Mary's belief in Eleanor's guilt, and I through the opposite. And what has been the result? With you, doubt, contradiction, constant unsettlement, and unwarranted resorts to strange sources for reconcilement between appearances and your own convictions. With me, growing assurance and a belief which each and every development so far has but served to strengthen and make more probable. Again that wild panorama of events, looks, and words swept before me. Mary's reiterated assertions of her cousin's innocence, Eleanor's attitude of lofty silence in regard to certain matters which might be considered by her as pointing towards the murderer. "Your theory must be the correct one," I finally admitted. "It was undoubtedly Eleanor who spoke. She believes in Mary's guilt, and I have been blind, indeed, not to have seen it from the first." "If Eleanor Leavenworth believes in her cousin's criminality, she must have some good reasons for doing so." I was obliged to admit that too. "She did not conceal in her bosom that tell-tale key, found who knows where, and destroy or seek to destroy it, and the letter which introduced her cousin to the public as the unprincipled destroyer of a trusting man's peace for nothing. No, no. And yet you, a stranger, a young man who have never seen Mary Leavenworth in any other light than that in which her coquettish nature sought to display itself, presume to say she is innocent, in the face of the attitude maintained from the first by her cousin." "But," said I, in my great unwillingness to accept his conclusions, "Eleanor Leavenworth is but mortal. She may have been mistaken in her inferences. She has never stated what her suspicion was founded upon, nor can we know what basis she has for maintaining the attitude you speak of. Clavering is as likely as Mary to be the assassin, for all we know, and possibly for all she knows." "You seem to be almost superstitious in your belief in Clavering's guilt." I recoiled. Was I? Could it be that Mr. Harwell's fanciful conviction in regard to this man had in any way influenced me to the detriment of my better judgment? "And you may be right," Mr. Gryce went on. "I do not pretend to be set in my notions. Future investigation may succeed in fixing something upon him, though I hardly think it likely. His behaviour as the secret husband of a woman possessing motives for the commission of a crime has been too consistent throughout." "All except his leaving her." "No exception at all, for he hasn't left her." "What do you mean?" "I mean that, instead of leaving the country, Mr. Clavering has only made a pretence of doing so. That in place of dragging himself off to Europe at her command, he has only changed his lodgings, and can now be found not only in a house opposite to hers, but in the window of that house, where he sits day after day watching who goes in and out of her front door." I remembered his parting injunction to me. in that memorable interview we had in my office, and saw myself compelled to put a new construction upon it. But I was assured at Hoffman House that he had sailed for Europe, and myself saw the man who professes to have driven him to the steamer. Just so. And Mr. Clavering returned to the city after that, in another carriage and to another house. And you tell me that man is all right? No, I only say there isn't the shadow of evidence against him as the person who shot Mr. Leavenworth. Rising, I paced the floor, and for a few minutes silence fell between us. But the clock, striking, recalled me to the necessity of the hour, and turning, I asked Mr. Gryce what he proposed to do now. "There is but one thing I can do," said he. "And that is?" "To go upon such lights as I have, and cause the arrest of Miss Leavenworth." I had by this time schooled myself to endurance, and was able to hear this without uttering an exclamation. But I could not let it pass without making one effort to combat his determination. "But," said I do not see what evidence you have positive enough in its character to warrant extreme measures. You have yourself intimated that the existence of motive is not enough, even though taken with the fact of the suspected party being in the house at the time of the murder. And what more have you to urge against Miss Leavenworth?" "Pardon me. I said Miss Leavenworth. I should have said Eleanor Leavenworth." "Eleanor? What? When you and all unite in thinking that she alone of all these parties to the crime is utterly guiltless of wrong?" "And yet who is the only one against whom positive testimony of any kind can be brought?" I could but acknowledge that. "Mr. Raymond," he remarked very gravely, "the public is becoming clamorous. Something must be done to satisfy it, if only for the moment. Eleanor has laid herself open to the suspicion of the police, and must take the consequences of her action. I am sorry. She is a noble creature. I admire her. But justice is justice, and though I think her innocent, I shall be forced to put her under arrest, unless— But I cannot be reconciled to it. It is doing an irretrievable injury to one whose only fault is an undue and mistaken devotion to an unworthy cousin. If Mary is the— "Unless something occurs between now and to-morrow morning," Mr. Gryce went on, as if I had not spoken. "To-morrow morning?" "Yes." I tried to realize it, tried to face the fact that all my efforts had been for nothing, and failed. "Will you not grant me one more day?" I asked in my desperation. What to do? Alas, I did not know. To confront Mr. Clavering and force from him the truth. "To make a mess of the whole affair," he growled. "No, sir, the die is cast. Eleanor Leavenworth knows the one point which fixes this crime upon her cousin, and she must tell us that point or suffer the consequences of her refusal." I made one more effort. "But why to-morrow? Having exhausted so much time already in our inquiries, why not take a little more, especially as the trail is constantly growing warmer? A little more moleing." "A little more folderol!" exclaimed Mr. Gryce, losing his temper. "No, sir, the hour for moling has passed. Something decisive has got to be done now. Though, to be sure, if I could find the one missing link I want—" "Missing link? What is that?" "The immediate motive of the tragedy. A bit of proof that Mr. Leavenworth threatened his niece with his displeasure, or Mr. Clavering with his revenge, would place me on the vantage point at once. No arresting of Eleanor then. No, my lady. I would walk right into your own gilded parlours, and when you ask me if I had found the murderer yet, say yes, and show you a bit of paper which would surprise you. But missing links are not so easily found. This has been mouled for, and mould for, as you are pleased to call our system of investigation, and totally without result. Nothing but the confession of some one of these several parties to the crime will give us what we want. I will tell you what I will do," he suddenly cried. "Miss Leavenworth has desired me to report to her. She is very anxious for the detection of the murderer, you know, and offers an immense reward. Well, I will gratify this desire of hers. The suspicions I have, together with my reasons for them, will make an interesting disclosure. I should not greatly wonder if they produced an equally interesting confession." I could only jump to my feet in horror. "At all events, I propose to try it. Eleanor is worth that much risk anyway." "It will do no good," said I. "If Mary is guilty, she will never confess it. If not, she will tell us who is." "Not if it is Clavering, her husband." "Yes, even if it is Clavering, her husband. She has not the devotion of Eleanor." That I could but acknowledge. She would hide no keys for the sake of shielding another. No. If Mary were accused, she would speak. The future opening before us looked sombre enough. And yet, when, in a short time from that, I found myself alone in a busy street, the thought that Eleanor was free rose above all others, filling and moving me till my walk home in the rain that day has become a marked memory of my life. It was only with nightfall that I began to realize the truly critical position in which Mary stood if Mr. Gryce's theory was correct. But once seized with this thought, nothing could drive it from my mind. Shrink as I would, it was ever before me, haunting me with the direst forebodings. Nor, though I retired early, could I succeed in getting either sleep or rest. All night I tossed on my pillow, saying over to myself with dreary iteration, "Something must happen, something will happen, to prevent Mr. Gryce doing this dreadful thing." Then I would start up and ask what could happen, and my mind would run over various contingencies, such as Mr. Clavering might confess, Hannah might come back, Mary herself wake up to her position and speak the word I had more than once seen trembling on her lips. But further thought showed me how unlikely any of these things were to happen, and it was with a brain utterly exhausted that I fell asleep in the early dawn, to dream I saw Mary standing above Mr. Gryce with a pistol in her hand. I was awakened from this pleasing vision by a heavy knock at the door. Hastily rising, I asked who was there. The answer came in the shape of an envelope thrust under the door. Raising it, I found it to be a note. It was from Mr. Gryce, and ran thus: "Come at once. Hannah Chester is found." "Hannah found?" "So we have reason to think." "When? Where? By whom?" "Sit down, and I will tell you." Drawing up a chair in a flurry of hope and fear, I sat down by Mr. Gryce's side. "She is not in the cupboard," that person dryly assured me, noting without doubt how my eyes went travelling about the room in my anxiety and impatience. "We are not absolutely sure that she is anywhere, but word has come to us that a girl's face believed to be Hannah's has been seen at the upper window of a certain house in don't start R, where a year ago she was in the habit of visiting while at the hotel with the Misses Leavenworth. Now, as it has already been determined that she left New York the night of the murder by the railroad, though for what point we have been unable to ascertain, we consider the matter worth inquiring into. But if she is there," resumed Mr. Gryce, "she is secreted, kept very close. No one except the informant has ever seen her, nor is there any suspicion among the neighbors of her being in town." "Hannah secreted at a certain house in R. Whose house?" Mr. Gryce honored me with one of his grimmest smiles. "The name of the lady she's with is given in the communication as Belden, Mrs. Amy Belden." "Amy Belden? The name found written on a torn envelope by Mr. Clavering's servant girl in London?" "Yes." I made no attempt to conceal my satisfaction. "Then we are upon the verge of some discovery." Providence has interfered, and Eleanor will be saved. But when did you get this word?" "Last night. Or rather this morning. Q brought it." "It was a message, then, to Q?" "Yes. The result of his molings while in R, I suppose." "Whom was it signed by?" "A respectable tinsmith who lives next door to Mrs. B." "And this is the first you knew of an Amy Belden living in R?" "Yes." "Widow or wife?" "Don't know. Don't know anything about her but her name." "But you have already sent Q to make inquiries?" "No. The affair is a little too serious for him to manage alone. He is not equal to great occasions, and might fail just for the lack of a keen mind to direct him. In short, I wish you to go. Since I cannot be there myself, I know of no one else sufficiently up in the affair to conduct it to a successful issue. You see, it is not enough to find and identify the girl. The present condition of things demands that the arrest of so important a witness should be kept secret. Now, for a man to walk into a strange house in a distant village, find a girl who is secreted there, frighten her, cajole her, force her, as the case may be, from her hiding place to a detective's office in New York, and all without the knowledge of the next door neighbour, if possible, requires judgment, brains, genius. Then the woman who conceals her, she must have her reasons for doing so, and they must be known. Altogether, the affair is a delicate one. Do you think you can manage it?" "I should like at least to try." Mr. Gryce settled himself on the sofa. "To think what pleasure I am losing on your account," he grumbled, gazing reproachfully at his helpless limbs. "But to business. How soon can you start?" "Immediately." "Good. A train leaves the depot at 12:15. Take that. Once in R, it will be for you to decide upon the means of making Mrs. Belden's acquaintance without arousing her suspicions. Q, who will follow you, will hold himself in readiness to render you any assistance you may require. Only this thing is to be understood. As he will doubtless go in disguise, you are not to recognize him, much less interfere with him and his plans, till he gives you leave to do so by some preconcerted signal. You are to work in your way, and he in his, till circumstances seem to call for mutual support and countenance. I cannot even say whether you will see him or not. He may find it necessary to keep out of the way, but you may be sure of one thing, that he will know where you are, and that the display of, well, let us say, a red silk handkerchief have you such a thing? I will get one. Will be regarded by him as a sign that you desire his presence or assistance, whether it be shown about your person or at the window of your room." "And these are all the instructions you can give me?" I said as he paused. "Yes. I don't know of anything else. You must depend largely upon your own discretion and the exigencies of the moment. I cannot tell you now what to do. Your own wit will be the best guide. Only, if possible, let me either hear from you or see you by to-morrow at this time." And he handed me a cipher in case I should wish to telegraph. Chapter 26. Book 3. Hannah. Chapter 27. Amy Belden. A merrier man within the limits of becoming mirth, I never spent an hour's talk withal. Love's Labour's Lost. I had a client in R by the name of Monell, and it was from him I had planned to learn the best way of approaching Mrs. Belden. When, therefore, I was so fortunate as to meet him, almost on my arrival, driving on the long road behind his famous trotter Alfred, I regarded the encounter as a most auspicious beginning of a very doubtful enterprise. "Well, "And how goes the day?" was his exclamation, as, the first greetings past, we drove rapidly into town. "Your part in it goes pretty smoothly," I returned; and, thinking I could never hope to win his attention to my own affairs till I had satisfied him in regard to his, I told him all I could concerning the lawsuit then pending, a subject so prolific of question and answer that we had driven twice round the town before he remembered he had a letter to post. As it was an important one, admitting of no delay, we hastened at once to the post office, where he went in, leaving me outside to watch the rather meagre stream of goers and comers who at that time of day make the post office of a country town their place of rendezvous. Among these, for some reason, I especially noted one middle aged woman. Why, I cannot say. Her appearance was anything but remarkable, and yet when she came out with two letters in her hand, one in a large and one in a small envelope, and meeting my eye hastily drew them under her shawl, I found myself wondering what was in her letters, and who she could be that the casual glance of a stranger should unconsciously move her to an action so suspicious. But Mr. Monell's reappearance at the same moment diverted my attention, and in the interest of the conversation that followed, I soon forgot both the woman and her letters. For, determined that he should have no opportunity to revert to that endless topic, a law case, I exclaimed with the first crack of the whip, "There! I knew there was something I wanted to ask you. It is this: are you acquainted with any one in this town by the name of Belden?" "There is a widow Belden in this town. I don't know of any other." "Is her first name Amy?" "Yes, Mrs. Amy Belden." "That is the one," said I. "Who is she? What is she? And what is the extent of your acquaintance with her?" "Well," said he, "I cannot conceive why you should be interested in such an antiquated piece of commonplace goodness as she is; but seeing you ask, I have no objection to telling you that she is the very respectable relict of a deceased cabinet maker of this town, that she lives in a little house down the street there, and that if you have any forlorn old tramp to be lodged overnight, or any destitute family of little ones to be looked after, she is the one to go to. As to knowing her, I know her as I do a dozen other members of our church there up over the hill. When I see her, I speak to her, and that is all." "A respectable widow, you say. Any family?" "No, she lives alone. Has a little income, I believe. Must have, to put the money on the plate, she always does. But spends her time in plain sewing and such deeds of charity as one with small means but willing heart can find the opportunity of doing in a town like this. But why in the name of wonders do you ask?" "A business," said I. "A business. Mrs. Belden don't mention it, by the way has got mixed up in a case of mine, and I felt it due to my curiosity, if not to my purse, to find out something about her. And I am not satisfied yet. The fact is, I would give something, Monell, for the opportunity of studying this woman's character. Now, couldn't you manage to get me introduced into her house in some way that would make it possible and proper for me to converse with her at my leisure? Business would thank you if you could." "Well, I don't know. I suppose it could be done. She used to take lodgers in the summer when the hotel was full, and might be induced to give a bed to a friend of mine who is very anxious to be near the post office on account of a business telegram he is expecting, and which, when it comes, will demand his immediate attention." And Mr. Monell gave me a sly wink of his eye, little imagining how near the mark he had struck. "You need not say that. Tell her I have a peculiar dislike to sleeping in a public house, and that you know of no one better fitted to accommodate me, for the short time I desire to be in town, than herself." "And what will be said of my hospitality in allowing you under these circumstances to remain in any other house than my own?" "I don't know. Very hard things, no doubt. But I guess your hospitality can stand it." "Well, if you persist, we will see what can be done." And driving up to a neat white cottage of homely but sufficiently attractive appearance, he stopped. "This is her house," said he, jumping to the ground. "Let's go in and see what we can do." Glancing up at the windows, which were all closed save the two on the verandah overlooking the street, I thought to myself, if she has anybody in hiding here, whose presence in the house she desires to keep secret, it is folly to hope she will take me in, however well recommended I may come. But yielding to the example of my friend, I alighted in my turn, and followed him up the short, grass-bordered walk to the front door. "As she has no servant, she will come to the door herself, so be ready," he remarked as he knocked. I had barely time to observe that the curtains to the window at my left suddenly dropped, when a hasty step made itself heard within, and a quick hand drew open the door, and I saw before me the woman whom I had observed at the post office, and whose action with the letters had struck me as peculiar. I recognized her at first glance, though she was differently dressed, and had evidently passed through some worry or excitement that had altered the expression of her countenance, and made her manner what it was not at that time, strained and a trifle uncertain. But I saw no reason for thinking she remembered me. On the contrary, the look she directed towards me had nothing but inquiry in it, and when Mr. Monell pushed me forward with the remark, "A friend of mine, in fact, my lawyer from New York," she dropped a hurried old-fashioned curtsy, whose only expression was a manifest desire to appear sensible of the honour conferred upon her, through the mist of a certain trouble that confused everything about her. "We have come to ask a favour, Mrs. Belden, but may we not come in?" said my client in a round, hearty voice, well calculated to recall a person's thoughts into their proper channel. "I have heard many times of your cosy home, and am glad of this opportunity of seeing it." And with a blind disregard to the look of surprised resistance with which she met his advance, he stepped gallantly into the little room, whose cheery red carpet and bright picture-hung walls showed invitingly through the half-open door at our left. Finding her premises thus invaded by a sort of French coup d'état, Mrs. Belden made the best of the situation, and pressing me to enter also, devoted herself to hospitality. As for Mr. Monell, he quite blossomed out in his endeavours to make himself agreeable, so much so that I shortly found myself laughing at his sallies, though my heart was full of anxiety lest, after all, our efforts should fail of the success they certainly merited. Meanwhile Mrs. Belden softened more and more, joining in the conversation with an ease hardly to be expected from one in her humble circumstances. Indeed, I soon saw she was no common woman. There was a refinement in her speech and manner, which, combined with her motherly presence and gentle air, was very pleasing. The last woman in the world to suspect of any underhanded proceeding, if she had not shown a peculiar hesitation when Mr. Monell broached the subject of my entertainment there. "I don't know, sir. I would be glad, but—" and she turned a very scrutinizing look upon me. "The fact is, I have not taken lodgers of late, and I have got out of the way of the whole thing, and am afraid I cannot make him comfortable. In short, you will have to excuse me." "But we can't," returned Mr. Monell. "What, entice a fellow into a room like this?" and he cast a hearty, admiring glance around the apartment, which, for all its simplicity, both its warm colouring and general air of cosiness amply merited, "and then turn a cold shoulder upon him when he humbly entreats the honour of staying a single night in the enjoyment of its attractions? No, no, Mrs. Belden, I know you too well for that. Lazarus himself couldn't come to your door and be turned away, much less a good-hearted, clever-headed young gentleman like my friend here." "You're very good," she began, an almost weak love of praise showing itself for a moment in her eyes, "but I have no room prepared. I have been house-cleaning, and everything is topsy-turvy. Mrs. Wright now over the way—" "My young friend is going to stop here," Mr. Monell broke in with frank positiveness. "If I cannot have him at my own house, and for certain reasons it is not advisable, I shall at least have the satisfaction of knowing he is in the charge of the best housekeeper in R." "Yes," I put in, but without too great a show of interest. "I should be sorry, once introduced here, to be obliged to go elsewhere." The troubled eye wavered away from us to the door. "I was never called inhospitable," she commenced, "but everything is in such disorder. What time would you like to come?" "I was in hopes I might remain now," I replied. I have some letters to write, and ask nothing better than for leave to sit here and write them." At the word letters, I saw her hand go to her pocket in a movement which must have been involuntary, for her countenance did not change, and she made the quick reply: "Well, you may. If you can put up with such poor accommodations as I can offer, it shall not be said I refused you what Mr. Monell is pleased to call a favour." And complete in her reception as she had been in her resistance, she gave us a pleasant smile, and ignoring my thanks, bustled out with Mr. Monell to the buggy, where she received my bag, and, what was doubtless more to her taste, the compliments he was now more than ever ready to bestow upon her. "I'll see that a room is got ready for you in a very short space of time," she said upon re entering. "Meanwhile, make yourself at home here, and if you wish to write, why, I think you will find everything for the purpose in these drawers." And wheeling up a table to the easy chair in which I sat, she pointed to the small compartments beneath, with an air of such manifest desire to have me make use of anything and everything she had, that I found myself wondering over my position with a sort of startled embarrassment that was not remote from shame. "Thank you, I have materials of my own," said I, and hastened to open my bag and bring out the writing case, which I always carried with me. "Then I will leave you," she said, and with a quick bend and a short, hurried look out of the window, she hastily quitted the room. I could hear her steps cross the hall, go up 2 or 3 stairs, pause, go up the rest of the flight, pause again, and then pass on. I was left on the first floor alone.
All right, so Grice kind of set Mr. Raymond up. Although his explanation for why he did it the way he did it makes sense, it saved some time and trouble and some shoe leather for people in his department to have Raymond tracking down the less likely of the 2 hypotheses that Grice was holding. So, in that respect, okay, that's cool. At the same time, wow, and willingness to go arrest Eleanor. Even though Grice believes Mary did it, the willingness to arrest Eleanor because of the public and because she's the only one who has any evidence against her seems pretty harsh. At the same time, it's hard to tell because of how old the book is. It is hard to tell if this was legit, if they would have done this in real life. It's also hard to tell if this wouldn't have been kind of a ploy to try and drum out the real killer. So if the real killer thinks, "Oh, well, they've arrested Eleanor, thank goodness I'm getting off scot-free so I can relax now." Maybe they think the killer is going to make a mistake because of that, and they'll have an easier time catching the person. We don't know. Grice has not let us in on any of that thinking that he's been doing, although clearly he has been doing a lot of thinking. And then Q comes up with finding Hannah, and now Amy Belden. And wow, the machinations to get Raymond into Amy Belden's house. I don't know about you. I felt totally sorry for her being played the way she's being played. At the same time, it does seem like something is going on. And the fact that letters are being treated the way they are by her, meh, this feels like there's something. There's something. And it's hard to fault them, especially Mr. Raymond, when Eleanor's neck is clearly on the line. It's hard to fault them for doing everything they can to try and find Hannah to shed some light on the situation. So there we go. Originally, I was just going to play the episode 26, and then I realized I left you guys hanging last week. I couldn't leave you hanging again. We had to go and get through the Amy Belden chapter as well. So I hope you enjoyed today's chapters, and I'll talk to you next week. You have a great one. Be well. Take care of each other. Wear a mask. Get vaccinated if you can. And I'll talk to you next week. All right. Take care. Have a great one. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on